Hey Crimestituents, this episode was recorded in October, weeks before the outcome of the 2024 elections. She's Sarah.
She's Harley, and we're gaveling in another session of Crime in Congress. So I have a kind of fun story for you today that touches on a much older case of, or at least accusations of, voter fraud in the United States. However, I think you will find that there are a lot of parallels to what we have seen and experienced in recent years.
I'm excited.
So our story starts in Kentucky, 1895. The Kentucky Democrat Party had controlled the state for most of its history until the gubernatorial election of 1895, when Republican William O. Bradley won the race. Obviously, the state's Democrats weren't too happy about this, and even thought that there had been some election interference from the county election commissioners.
It's always the county, folks.
It always is, you know? So in response, the state's Democrats passed what is called the Gobles election law, which passed along strict party lines and over Governor Bradley's veto. The effort was led by the Democrat president pro tem of the state Senate at this time, William Gobles.
Did he name it after himself?
He sure did. So Gobles was born January 4th, 1856 in Pennsylvania to German immigrants. His father had served in the Civil War for the Union, and when he was discharged from the Army, he moved his family to Covington, Kentucky. Gobles attended school in Covington before becoming an apprentice to a jeweler in Cincinnati, Ohio, which his father encouraged. However, in the mid-1870s, after a short stint in Hollingsworth Business College, I believe that's how you pronounce it, Gobles began an apprenticeship at the law firm of Democrat John W. Stevenson, the former governor of Kentucky from 1867 to 1871. Gobles' relationship with Stevenson would really set him up for the rest of his life. After graduating from Cincinnati Law School in 1877 and joining the practice of Kentucky State Representative John Carlisle, Gobles returned to Stevenson's firm in Covington in 1883 following the death of Stevenson's previous law partner. Eventually, Gobles would become the executor of Stevenson's estate as well. So obviously, Stevenson played a huge role in getting Gobles involved in politics, and his support made Gobles' run for state senate a no-brainer. In a few years' time, Gobles became a formidable politician and had his sights set on a run for governor in 1899.
That year sounds fake. 1899. I don't like it.
Well, it only goes downhill from here. Get ready.
It's just a weird number.
So I thought this was interesting, but generally speaking, there were many pro-Confederacy or at least Confederate sympathizer voices in the Kentucky Democrat Party at this time. So Gobles was in many ways a different kind of Kentucky Democrat, with his father having served for the Union during the Civil War, and Gobles was able to appeal to urban and black voters. Appearance-wise, Gobles was described in historian James Clotter's book, William Gobles, The Politics of Wrath, as having contiguous lips, a sharp nose, small, ferret-like, glassy, dark blue, humorless eyes, black, slicked-down hair, a pale face, and heavy jaws. Clotter also quoted another reporter who said that he had, quote-unquote, never seen a man who physically so closely suggested the reptilian as this man did.
That's tough. I'm picturing like Peter Pettigrew Slytherin crossover here with this guy's appearance.
Yes, and I think let me pull up a picture for you.
Okay, I'm very excited. We'll put this on our Instagram for listeners too.
Yes, of course.
Okay, I'm looking at him and he's not terrible looking.
No, he's not terrible looking.
I feel like this description is a bit harsh.
I feel like maybe his personality played a big role into why they called him all these things, as we'll get into a little bit. Yeah, so it just seems like Gobles was not an exciting person in general. That same author said this, quote unquote, to one friend, Gobles had few qualities of a great politician, save a great mind. And, quote unquote, by the time he entered politics, Gobles lived a plain, unexciting private life. He seldom visited the theater or indicated any interest in sports. He drank beer in moderation, and he quit smoking cigars in later life. Timid and awkward in lady society, Goble very seldom, if ever, was romantically linked to any woman.
Doesn't sound like Goble could handle me or you. We'd be too much.
Yeah. We are, first of all, seldom visited the theater.
Yeah. Couldn't be me.
What are you talking about? Yeah. I understand that he had no interest in sports. I get it. Okay,
Yeah.
that's fine. But anyways, so I will note that Goble was also involved in what can be roughly described as a duel with a man he called Gonorrhea John.
I feel like I've met a couple gonorrhea Johns before.
Yeah. They're all over the city.
But okay, I need to know more.
So the man's real name was John Stamford, and the story goes that Stamford, a banker, was able to block Goble from getting this judgeship that he wanted. So an impromptu duel resulted in the death of John. However, Goble pleaded self-defense and was acquitted, which was notable because the Kentucky Constitution prohibited dueling.
Interesting.
Yeah.
But you haven't answered my big question, which is like, where does gonorrhea come into this?
This is just what Goble wanted to call John. Gonorrhea John. Like, he, wrote it in, the papers or whatever.
And it just stuck.
Yeah. But anyways, back to the 1899 election for governor. So it was a rocky start for the state's Democrats. The Democratic nominating convention in June 1898 at the Music Hall on Market Street in Louisville was chaos. Goble was in competition with the former Kentucky Attorney General P. Watt Hardin and former Congressman William J. Stone. Hardin, backed by the Louisville and Nashville Railroad, was favored to win. Sorry, I think I said Willowed.
Willowed.
Oh, I sound really hard.
I'm really starting to like this.
I'm really starting to like this podcast. Anyways. To prevent the nomination of Hardin, who was backed by the Railroads, Goble and Stone formed an alliance. And at the nominating convention, the pair helped elect a chairman aligned with their interests, but tensions escalated as Hardin supporters accused them of intimidation. So as voting began, Hardin withdrew his candidacy, believing that he was being cheated. However, when Goble's delegates did not split their votes as agreed, the alliance faltered. The convention became chaotic, with repeated deadlocks over the nomination. Eventually, after lengthy deliberations and disruptions, Goble secured the nomination when Stone was forced out and his supporters shifted their votes to Goble.
Isn't it kind of refreshing to hear about chaos like this centuries ago? It makes me think, okay, we can survive. Our country can survive things like this.
No, 1,000%. And, that point only becomes more evident as, we go through the rest of this case. There are so many parallels and so many times where you're like, oh, man, we've seen this movie before? I didn't know.
I think I've seen this film before.
Yeah.
Did not like the ending.
Yeah, for this one especially.
Awesome.
After the Music Hall Convention, dissatisfaction lingered among some of the Democrats, particularly William Stone, who accused Goble of breaking their agreement. This prompted figures like W.C. Owens, a former congressman, to encourage Democrats to support the Republican candidate instead. Then, a faction of Democrats called for a new convention. At this convention in August, they nominated former Kentucky Governor John Y. Brown, who adopted a platform condemning the Music Hall Convention and the Goble election law. They called their sect of the party the quote-unquote honest election Democrats. So on the Republican side was sitting Attorney General William S. Taylor. To placate the sitting Republican Governor Bradley, who was upset about not being picked for renomination, Taylor decided to offer the Secretary of State position to Bradley's son if he would campaign for Taylor. The son refused, and instead William Taylor named a man named Caleb Powers for the slot.
The way you said that makes me think he's important to the story.
Indeed he is.
Ooh.
Caleb Powers, a farmer's son raised in the mountains of Kentucky, was emerging as a political figure who had served as the school's superintendent in Knox County. He was educated at Union College, A&M, and Lexington, and even attended West Point before leaving due to vision issues. He also studied at Northern Indiana Normal School's law department and completed a postgraduate course at Center College. In January of 1896, Caleb married his sweetheart, Laura Rawlings. However, in July of that same year, Laura died due to cerebrospinal meningitis. Sorry, that took me a minute to fully say. But this death absolutely crushed Caleb. And from there, he really focused all of his energy into practicing law and then being the superintendent and diving into politics. From Caleb's words, he felt like his, quote unquote, days of social and domestic happiness were at an end.
Do you think this changed him?
Totally. I mean, I think that has to change a person, right? But like many men, as Harley, you've said before, instead of going to therapy for this,
they got deeper into politics.
Yes, exactly. So to summarize overall, it was a three-way race for governor between Democrat Goble, the honest election Democrat Brown, and Republican William Taylor. And this is where things start hitting a little too close to home. In the days before the election on November 7th, 1899, both Republicans and Democrats warned of election fraud and possible violence perpetrated by the other side. Despite these concerns, Election Day was largely peaceful, but voting returns came in slowly, and by election night, the results were still too close to determine a winner. So allegations of fraud surfaced immediately. In Nelson County, 1,200 ballots misspelled Taylor's name, which prompted folks to argue that these votes should be disqualified. In Knox and Johnson counties, voters raised concerns about thin tissue ballots, which made their choices visible when they put it into the ballot box. Additionally, one Democrat political leader called for the invalidation of all votes of Louisville, claiming that the state militia had intimidated voters in that area.
Dang.
I know. As James Clotter described in his book, 3 days after the election, the Louisville Dispatch warned that Goble would not accept the legitimate results and would risk civil war. Yep. And during that period, the Evening Post editor asked citizens to, quote-unquote, stop the steal of the governorship.
Wait, so stop the steal is not a new slogan?
Right? Like, I always thought that that was something that had been made up in recent years. I had no idea it had, like, a historical root, I guess.
This is total sidebar, but we are fighting for our lives in this pumpkin carving competition. I realized if you go in an incognito window, you can vote as many times as you want. And so I've been texting people with hashtag start the steal.
Oh no. Oh no. But yeah, I mean, I find it both comforting and incredibly alarming how history is shown to repeat itself like over and over.
But yeah, I find it more comforting, to be honest, because we didn't even know about this.
Yeah.
Like the impact this had on history, not huge. Granted, we're not talking about the presidential election here, but it's kind of comforting that eventually our problems might just become a blip on the radar.
I like it. Hopefully. Fingers crossed.
Hopefully. Or Armageddon.
Yeah.
One or the other.
It's really tough to say at this point. Meanwhile, up in the mountains of Kentucky, Caleb Powers' Knox County Republicans pledged their lives to, quote unquote, resist the awful encroachment of our most sacred rights, end quote, and that Taylor would be given his rightful office by, quote unquote, peaceable means if we can, but by forcible ones if we must.
So it seems like we're suggesting that violence might be the solution here.
That's what I would gather as well. So with all this controversy, the election results were now up to the election board that had been created by Goble and was stacked with loyal Democrats and friends of Goble.
Conflict of interest.
The day the board convened, December 4th, 1899, hundreds of Republicans, many of them brandishing guns, flocked to Frankfort outside where the board was meeting to exercise a moral influence on the contest, aka to compel the board to make a fair decision. To the surprise of, I'm sure, Goble and everyone else, the board made a 2-1 decision to uphold the announced vote tally and hold up Taylor's win over Goble. As James Clotter said, Goble had overlooked only one thing in his scheme to gain power, the possibility that the commissioners might be honest.
Poor Goble. He did everything in his power to rig the election, and his own people just went and followed the law. Crazy.
No, I mean, you can do everything right to break the law, and I'm not connecting thoughts today.
You know what? He could still win this election if the election board has the courage.
Yeah, exactly. So Taylor was inaugurated as governor on December 12th, 1899. However, the furious Democrats convened on December 14th and urged Goble and the nominated lieutenant governor, J.C.W. Beckham, to challenge the election results. You see, the Goble election law had a sneaky little provision that allowed the state legislature to be the final judge of the governor and lieutenant governor's races. And with heavy Democrat majorities in both state house and Senate, this plan might just work.
Question.
Yes.
I'm assuming Goble had to give up his state Senate seat in order to run?
Incorrect.
Okay, so he's voting himself.
Yes.
Ooh, okay.
So a little over a month later, the General Assembly convened on January 2nd, 1900.
Much better year.
Yeah. Democrat majority quickly voted in Goble as the president pro tem of the Kentucky Senate.
This is just, like, brazen.
Yeah. Following this, new Governor Taylor made a floor speech against Goble, saying that choosing between him and Goble was a choice between a future of glorious progress or one darkened by civil and commercial oppression. As soon as the speech was over, the Democrats filed a notice of contest for the offices of governor and lieutenant governor. Goble said that with the misspelled and see-through ballots, as well as the alleged voter and commissioner intimidation, that thousands of ballots should be invalidated and that Goble himself should be declared governor as a result.
They're just assuming that the ballots invalidated would help Goble, though. There's still a chance that if they invalidated a bunch of ballots, Taylor could still win.
Right, very true. So the next day, the General Assembly appointed a committee to investigate the allegations. While the members of the committee were supposedly drawn at random, it seems that it was definitely rigged, as the final committee for the governor's race had 9 Democrats and 1 Republican, and 1 populist who usually voted with the Democrats.
No, that's totally random, Sarah.
Yeah, no, not rigged at all.
Yeah, no.
Again, you can just do everything right, and still things won't work out for you. So on the 15th of January, the committee began to hear evidence on the governor's race. Once again, folks on both sides of the fence expected the committee would invalidate enough ballots to make Goble governor. And once again, tensions were rising. So I thought this was also interesting as well, but James Clotter in his book noted that by 1890, Kentucky's overall murder rate stood second highest in the nation, and that Kentucky was increasingly seen of that as a bloody, lawless mountaineer or right-frocked, hot-tempered gentleman planted with a pistol in his hand. And, spoiler alert, the events of the next 15 days or so would definitely not help this image.
Uh-oh.
So by around January 25th, hundreds of armed men from the mountains of Kentucky were once again flocking to the Capitol as a show of force against any unfair decisions made by the committee. The leader of this group was none other than Caleb Powers, the Secretary of State under Taylor. In his autobiography, Powers claimed that other groups of protesters from around the state had also planned a trip to the Capitol, but had stopped short of actually making the journey. Powers indicated that perhaps he wouldn't have brought his ragtag crew of mountaineers if the other protest leads had told him in time that they were not coming.
Okay, wait, I want to make sure I understand. So, Powers was like the sole leader of this group.
Yeah, there were a bunch of Republicans who were now in the Capitol with guns, protesting, essentially.
In the Capitol, not outside.
Outside the Capitol. Okay. Sorry. Outside the Capitol protesting. But yeah, Caleb Powers brought his own ragtag crew of mountaineers. Governor Taylor, for his part, ordered many of the mountain men to return home, and many complied. However, 200 to 300 stayed behind, waiting for the election committee's findings.
Yikes, I'm like scared.
Despite the calls for violence against him, Goble didn't seem too fazed. As James Clotter described, on the cold morning of January 30th, 1900, Goble left his hotel and met up with his friends/bodyguards, F. Lillard, who was the warden of the penitentiary, and Jack P. Sorry, this name always cracks me up. Jack P. quote-unquote Dirk Knife Chen.
Dirk Knife Chen. Okay. Amazing. No notes.
I love that nickname. Dirk Knife Chen.
It's impeccable.
Anyways, the 3 men made their way to the Capitol, which was just a few blocks away from the hotel. As they entered the Capitol grounds, it was surprisingly quiet, and Goble thought that maybe more of the mountain men had left. Bodyguard Lillard then moved ahead to make certain that the Capitol interior was safe, while Dirk Knife Chen lagged behind Goble just by a few feet. Just as Lizard... That's not his name.
It could be, with the other names in here.
I know, we need more nicknames. Lillard is Lizard.
Lizard, okay.
But anyways, just as Lillard reached the Capitol steps by around 11:15 a.m., he heard a rifle go off. He quickly turned around and saw that Goble had been shot. More muffled shots were heard, and Chen rushed up, exclaiming, "Goble, they have killed you!" Goble tried to get up, but Chen told him to lie down, or they will shoot you again. Bystanders then carried Goble back to the hotel. When the doctor arrived, Goble was in bad shape. The bullet had entered 3 inches to the right and a half inch above the nipple, shattered the rib, sent the bone splintering into one lung, pierced the right lung, and exited through the back near a vertebrae.
Ooh.
Yeah. Tough shot. The same day, the committee convened and voted on party lines to recommend that Goble be made governor and Beckham lieutenant governor.
Talk about an explosive situation.
Yeah, absolutely. So almost immediately, Governor Taylor declared a state of insurrection and mobilized the state militia. He also summoned the legislature to a special session due to happen a week later, but not in Frankfurt, but in the heavily Republican city of London. The Democrats ignored this and tried to convene again in Frankfurt, but the entrance to the Capitol was blocked by armed citizens.
Like the militia or just this ragtag group?
Nope, just the ragtag group.
Amazing.
Yep. The next day, the Democrats met in the hotel where Goble was to certify the contest committee's findings, invalidating enough votes to make Goble himself the governor. So Goble, pretty much on his deathbed, was sworn in as governor.
So they technically have 2 governors right now.
Yeah, correct. And Goble immediately ordered the state militia to stand down and reverse Taylor's call to have the General Assembly meet in London. Again, we have 2 governors. So by now, there were hundreds of armed men, both Republicans and Democrats, milling about Frankfurt and near the Capitol, and many feared that a large-scale armed conflict was imminent.
Yeah, and this isn't that long after the Civil War, too.
Yeah.
Like those images of violence and what it's like to live under that sort of atmosphere is pretty fresh for people.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's top of mind.
Mm-hmm.
Back at the hotel, though, Goble was dying. And on February 3rd, 3 days after being sworn in as governor, and a little over 100 hours after being shot, Goble passed away. Goble, fun fact, is the only American governor to ever die in office from assassination.
Wow, it's actually surprising.
I know, right? You want to know his last words?
Of course.
Quote unquote, "Doc, that was a damned bad oyster."
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm inspired.
Yeah, so apparently the Democrats afterwards kind of tried to spin it in the paper saying that Goble had, this great, amazing last word speech situation. I'm pontificating over, how the state government works and, this is yada, 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 right? But really that was a damn bad oyster.
That's so real, though. It actually bugs me in, movies when someone says something super profound and then dies.
Yeah.
I was watching... Crazy Friday night. I was watching Ella Enchanted last night.
Oh, wow.
And that happens where the mom, I think, says something really profound to her daughter and then dies. And I'm like, no, it doesn't happen that way. Your brain's not firing enough for you to give good life advice.
Right, exactly. That's usually not the last words.
No.
So with the death of Goble, 2 questions remained. Who legally was the governor? And who killed Goble?
That's what I want to know.
Goble's death, unfortunately, simmered down the tensions on both sides, and folks kind of decided that they didn't want a civil war in the state of Kentucky after all. Good choice. Members from both sides of the aisle came up with this proposed solution. Number 1, Democrats would receive acknowledgement that Goble had been legally selected governor and that Beckham now was the rightful heir to the office. Number 2, Republicans would vow to remove the militia from Frankfurt. Number 3, Democrats promised to grant immunity to Republican officials like Governor Taylor and to postpone legislative activities for a week and to stop contested elections from other senators and representatives in the General Assembly. And number 4, the legislature would establish a new, absolutely fair and nonpartisan election law, abolishing the Goble election law.
It kind of sounds like the Democrats got everything they wanted.
It definitely sounds like that. And I will say, with them holding majorities in both the state Senate and the state House, I think that was probably what was going to end up happening. But at least they're trying to make a new election law that's not as horrible as the first, even though it actually kind of worked out for them. I don't know. Anyways, Governor Taylor refused to sign this agreement. And although he did tell the militias to stand down, simply put, Taylor thought that he had rightfully won and that he wasn't going to back down. When the legislature convened again in February, both sides contended that they had control over the Senate and the governorship. Finally, both sides agreed that the case would be decided in the courts.
I feel like it should have gotten there a lot sooner.
Yeah, right? So on March 10th, 1900, a circuit court ruled in favor of Beckham and the Democrats. Remember, Beckham was Gobles' lieutenant governor and was now to ascend to the governorship. The Republicans appealed, but the Kentucky Court of Appeals upheld the circuit court's decision with a 6-1 vote, officially unseating Governor Taylor and his lieutenant governor.
That's crazy because the votes were in favor of Taylor, right?
Yeah, by like a good couple thousand.
I wonder what evidence they had. Do you know?
No.
Okay.
Like that, the evidence they had were like the see-through ballots and like intimidation and stuff. But again, it's just when you look at majorities, I think it was very split on partisan lines.
And you would assume that at least with the see-through ballots, that would probably impact everyone's vote regardless of party.
I guess the idea was that the folks working the polls could see who people voted for and then take out those votes.
Okay, I see.
I think was the idea. But as you will see as this episode goes along, partisan majorities, even in the courts, are very important. While the case was brought to the Supreme Court, the court declined to intervene, stating that there was no federal issues at stake. So now, fearing that he could be arrested, unseated Governor Taylor fled to Indiana and never returned.
Fleeing to Indiana is hilarious.
I know, right? Like, not another country with an extradition policy, just to Indiana. Very 1800s of it all.
Mm-hmm. Oh, wait, aren't we in 1900 now?
Oh, sorry, exactly 1900.
He's bringing this 1800s behavior into the 1900s.
It's unacceptable.
No, it really is. Leave that in 1899 where it belongs.
So now back to our second question. Who killed Goble after all? The truth is, we still don't actually know. But there is a reason that I mentioned the Republican Secretary of State under Governor Taylor, Caleb Powers, and his band of mountain men protesters.
Tell me more.
So the day of the shooting, I will note there was a man named Holland Whitaker who was heavily armed in charge of the assassination. But at the end of the day, he was just unlikely the shooter. The investigation was essentially headed up by the state legislature instead of actual law enforcement. So there are some obvious concerns about how politics affected the investigation. In fact, the legislature appropriated $100,000. Today, that would be over $3 million for the investigation, and hired folks to conduct a proper investigation.
Whoa.
Yeah. Those investigators were eligible for a sum of $25,000, close to $1 million today, and was set apart by the commission.
Yeah, it seems like the investigators were incentivized to maybe look towards the Republicans on this one.
And I agree with you.
And also, I'm thinking about this in modern terms. This is kind of sort of like the select committee on January 6th, except can you imagine if they actually had the power to charge people?
Yeah.
That would have been chaos.
Is that so interesting? Mm-hmm. So the leaders of the investigation started zeroing in to some folks in Taylor's administration, including Caleb Powers. However, when Goble was shot, Powers was on a trip to Louisville. Nevertheless, Taylor was still a top suspect. On March 9th, 1900, warrants were issued for Caleb Powers and a few other figures in Taylor's administration. When they finally found Powers, he had been trying to flee the state by train in army clothing to escape the quote-unquote wrath of a passion-fueled party, partisan courts, and the perjury and corruption consequent to the enormous blood money fund. In Caleb's own words.
Wow.
In Caleb's possession, he also had a signed document by Governor Taylor himself, pardoning him for alleged complicity in the murder of William Goble. Powers claimed that this pardon was not an admission of guilt, but rather a proactive protection granted by the former governor.
I don't know how I feel about that, because I think I want to say that if you're asking for a pardon, you're probably guilty.
Right.
But given this climate that they're in, I also see it the other way, where he's like, they're going to get me for whatever they want, and they're going to just keep fighting until they get it.
Right.
So I should do the same thing.
I don't know. It's very curious. I can see both sides.
Mm-hmm.
So in his own book, Caleb Powers describes being thrown on the ground once apprehended, his shirt being ripped off, and being given a head wound despite not resisting his arrest and jailing. And from his jail cell the night he was arrested, Powers penned this statement for the press. Are you ready for it?
I'm so excited.
I have nothing to say except that I desire a speedy trial and have no fear of its result before a non-partisan court injury. I never had in the past threatened, nor have I now in the actual prosecution, but two things to fear, and they are evil and corrupt influence that $100,000 can have in the prosecution of any case, and the political influence that will be incident to these trials. That these are not small things to fear, any sober-thinking man must confess. I am innocent of the charge preferred against me, and I am willing for the public to know my entire connection with the very bitter strife in this campaign.
I'm trying to think how I would have crafted this statement. I think it's actually pretty good.
Right?
Yeah, I think it's a pretty good statement. I like that he just jumps to a speedy trial and doesn't waste a ton of time defending himself. But it also doesn't really give me any reason to want to support him either.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a tactic we see super often now, and just jumping to this is due to a partisan court, a partisan investigation, right? Like that's something we hear all the time. No admonishment, for any crimes committed, just more so, oh, this is a witch hunt. This is a witch hunt, right?
But it is this time.
Right.
Which is why I'm kind of looking at it like...
But you'll see some of the evidence, though.
Okay.
Maybe? I don't know. It's really hard to say. Someone definitely killed William Goble, and I don't know. I kind of think power still kind of looks good for it. Maybe?
Okay.
I don't know. We'll see. So a month later, Judge James E. Cantrell convened the Franklin County Grand Jury. Not for nothing. Cantrell was a former Democratic legislator, former lieutenant governor, and an old friend of Gobles.
Of course.
Yes. So from the beginning, Republicans were ringing the alarm bells over biased court proceedings, even saying that the grand jury was packed. At the end of the proceedings, the grand jury indicted 10 men, including Henry E. Utsi of the Auditor's Office, James B. Howard of Eastern Kentucky, and Secretary of State Caleb Powers.
It sounds like he's the highest level official to be indicted.
Correct. And that's why they definitely wanted to go after him. The trial itself wasn't much better in terms of political bias. Judge Cantrell himself presided, and the jury was packed with Goble Democrats. The prosecution was led by attorney Thomas C. Campbell, who was brought in by Justice and Arthur Goble. Yes, William Goble's brothers. So again, not biased at all.
Yeah, this is not looking good for Powers and company.
No.
They just have to hope that these people are going to be honest.
Right, exactly. Just as in with the Goble election law. It's like, gosh, just please be honest. So during the trial, which began on July 9th, 1900, the prosecution really focused on Caleb, as he was the highest-ranking government official. The theory from the prosecution was that Powers had brought in that band of mountain men to intimidate the legislature, and then, having failed to do that, decided to mastermind the killing of Goble. It was then thought that he worked with Henry Utsi to have James Howard shoot Goble through the window of Powers' Secretary of State office. Powers' office was on the first floor of the executive building and in the corner nearest the spot where Senator Goble was shot. Powers, for his part, made his way up to Louisville to have a secure alibi.
I'm picturing him as the, what was his name? That, shaman guy on January 6th with, the horns.
Oh, yeah, right, yeah.
That's the mental image I have right now.
There's just a lot of recent imagery that plays into this case, unfortunately. Part of the evidence for this was that a bullet was discovered lodged in a tree about 10 days after the shooting, and a surveyor employed by the prosecution was able to trace the trajectory back to Caleb Powers' window. Yeah. So the prosecution also brought forth several witnesses who said that the bullet seemed to have come from the window, although many had a different account day of. And there was also a witness who said that he had seen Utsi with the rifle a few days before the shooting, and that Utsi allegedly said, quote unquote, "If trouble comes, I'm going to be prepared." Which, I don't know. Yeah.
I'm not sure how great ballistics were either at this time.
Right.
That seems very convenient.
And there were so many different accounts too of where the bullet came from that I think it's pretty unreliable overall.
And how do they know it was that bullet?
And yeah,
10
and also
days later.
10 days later, lodged in a tree. I don't know.
Sus. Do we know for sure that Howard had a gun that day?
I guess we don't.
Interesting.
So in addition, the prosecution had several witnesses who testified that they had heard about the plan for assassination from Powers himself. However, it seems like a lot of the witnesses perjured themselves and were harassed by the prosecution to testify in exchange for not being prosecuted.
Of course.
One witness, William's close associate, Wharton Golden, ended up admitting that, quote unquote, he would go to the penitentiary for life if he did not testify for the prosecution. So,
Wow.
So the defense for their part, brought out several witnesses that said, number one, the bullet came from the third floor window and not Powers' office. Okay. And that two, Yutzi was acting weird, but there was no connection to Powers.
Maybe he was acting weird because people were throwing his name around as a potential murder suspect.
Right. And also the state is like 1 inch away from civil war. Everyone's on edge. I don't know.
Everyone was being weird.
Yeah.
This whole thing
We're
is
all
just weird.
So Powers himself even got on the stand. And throughout his testimony and cross-examination, Powers was apparently calm, cool, and collected, despite Attorney Campbell getting into his face. Powers admitted to saying some inflammatory things, bringing his band of mountain men to the Capitol, but maintained that he was not part of the assassination plot. In the end, though, the jury found Powers guilty and he was sentenced to life imprisonment. However, our story doesn't end there. And this won't be the first time that Powers is tried for his alleged role in the assassination.
Oh boy.
Before we get into that, let's first talk about the trials of Yutzi and Howard, the other two big players in the prosecution's case. James Howard, the alleged shooter, was 33 years old, married with 3 children. James Howard had been involved in this White Baker feud, which refers to this decades-long conflict between families in Clay County in which a good number of folks were killed. But anyways, the prosecution pointed to Howard's history of violence connected to the White Baker feud, in addition to bringing several witnesses who placed Howard in the vicinity at the time of the shooting. Not with a gun, just in the vicinity.
But weren't there hundreds of people in the vicinity?
Yes, correct.
Okay.
The defense was pretty weak, unfortunately. Howard claimed that he was in a hotel during the shooting, but his witnesses were not very strong. And once again, Judge Cantrell presided, and the jury, filled with Goble Democrats, returned a verdict of guilty and called for the death penalty.
Okay. I feel like it would not have been that hard to sow some reasonable doubt here because of how many people were there.
Sure.
Like, I wonder why... From my perspective, I almost wouldn't have put so much weight behind claiming that he was at the hotel because it ultimately doesn't matter. They can't prove that it was him.
Right.
So...
I mean,
it's interesting.
Yeah, these cases are super weak, but it's just the fact that the jury is so packed.
Right.
And also, Judge Cantrell had, I can't completely remember what it is, but some of his, rulings throughout the court proceedings themselves were come on, you're going to allow that,
Whenever there's, some conflicts of interest or some corruption, I'm going to start calling people Gobles.
Yeah, I love that.
Such a Goble right now.
Such a Goble. Oh my gosh, relax. So the trial for Henry Yutzi was set up similarly, with a packed jury and a biased Judge Cantrell presiding.
He presided over all 3 cases.
Yeah.
I don't like that either.
Yeah, not great. However, there is a bit of high drama during this trial. So remember, Yutzi was accused of being the middleman between Powers and the actual shooter, Howard, and that Yutzi met up with Howard to give him the key to Powers' office and special bullets that would, quote-unquote, penetrate the bulletproof vest that Goble usually wore.
I don't know if I trust 1900s bulletproof technology.
Yeah, correct. And also, what kind of special... I don't know.
Was it a suit of armor?
Literally, was it like a metal sheet? Unknown. But he apparently usually wore it. Obviously not that day.
Yeah. Should have worn it.
Unless he was, and then the special bullets worked. Who's to say? Not enough research on that.
The bulletproof vest just didn't work.
Yeah.
I think that's the most likely situation.
It was just feathers, yeah. It was just tar and feathers.
It was just, what's that stuff that when, you punch it, it's really hard, but if you touch it slowly, it's soft?
I don't know.
About that, what is it? It's, hold on, I gotta find it.
Pause.
Oobleck.
I don't think I've ever heard about this.
So basically, you make it with cornstarch and water, and when you punch it or you put force on it really fast, it becomes like a cement brick. You can't penetrate it. But if you go in slowly, it's a liquid.
Oh, that's definitely what he was wearing.
So yeah, he was wearing oobleck.
Yeah. Duh. So apparently there was actually some pretty good evidence to suggest that Yutzi had bought the special bullets. Again, this is the 1900s. This is exactly 1900. Sorry.
And did he buy them specifically for this purpose, or did he already have them?
Right. It seems like he did buy them specifically, but
that's honestly though, that's the strongest bit of evidence we've heard.
Right. Exactly.
So far.
Again, I maybe I take back my previous take. It seems like Yutzi was definitely involved. I'm not sure about the extent of Powers.
Okay.
But anyways, this is where the trial gets really interesting. So William Gobles' brother, Arthur, testified on the stand that Yutzi had told him that he was guilty.
Oh.
Yeah. And in response, Yutzi stood up and shouted, quote unquote, "That's a lie. I hope God will kill me if I ever said a word to that man or he to me."
I will admit, I have a hard time siding with anyone with the last name Goble right now, but drama.
So as James Clotter wrote, and I have to just read this entire excerpt because it's great. The judge ordered him to sit down, but Yutzi refused to do so. Yutzi said, "There is no blood on my hands, not a particle, and I want everybody to see it. I am innocent." As deputies tried to restrain him, Yutzi fell on the floor. He sobbed and shouted and seemed to faint and could not be revived. The next day, doctors told the court that Yutzi was temporarily deranged, and during the rest of the trial, the defendant laid lifeless on a cot brought daily into the courtroom.
We've said it before on this podcast. People do not faint the way they used to.
No. They were for the theatrics on this. Bringing his lifeless coma body into the courtroom every day for this trial is hilarious. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. I really want to know what he had on.
Right.
Was it like the open back hospital gown? Was he still in a suit?
Yeah.
Because I don't know if they were out on bail or something. Was he in a prisoner's outfit?
Was he handcuffed to the cot? There are so many questions.
So many questions. And did he have to use a bedpan during the trial?
Right. What?
Oh my gosh.
So many questions. So many questions. So this is how the trial's going. So after this whole Yutzi falling into a coma, fainting, whatever it is, Arthur Goble did get back up on the stand, and he testified, that Yutzi had told him everything, and that the former governor had actually even blessed the idea. So Governor Taylor had blessed this idea of killing Goble. Like his other co-conspirators, though, the jury returned a guilty verdict with imprisonment for life as the sentence. But miraculously, after a few days, Yutzi made a full recovery.
Wow.
Turns out he had actually faked this coma because, and this is a real quote, "It seemed to be the best thing I could do."
Okay. I did see this coming. Because I think most of these fainting stories from this period are just absolute BS. But he just wanted to lay down.
No, the fact that he, for the rest of the trial, was on this cot, he had to pretend to be lifeless, he's bleh.
I am a horizontal girly. I love laying down. So honestly, I would do this.
Yeah, I'm so tired of this trial. I gotta lay down.
I'm stressed. I don't want to look these people in the eye.
Yeah.
This is probably the last time I will see freedom. I'm gonna get myself a cot.
Yeah, and he's maybe the jury will have sympathy if I'm literally there lifeless. That's the only. I love that. That's the best thing I could do.
Yeah. Honestly, go off. I support being comfy in the courtroom.
Yeah, I agree. Hopefully he was in a hospital gown.
Yes. I hope they went all out.
Yeah. However, unlike Powers and Howard, Yutzi did not appeal his guilty verdict.
Interesting.
So the Kentucky Court of Appeals actually had a Republican majority at this time, and the court overturned both guilty verdicts for Powers and Howard, sending them back for new trials.
Wow.
Yep. The court found several things wrong with how the first trials had gone down, including Judge Cantrell's prejudice rulings regarding the admission of evidence, his charge to the jury, and the use of Howard's past records in the Clay County murders.
Here we go again. And it does sound like they're making the right call this time, but I'm worried they're overcorrecting and now it's going to be biased against the Democrats.
Yeah. So, as you said, here we go again. But this time I'm going to start with the Howard trial and then circle back to Powers. So Howard's second trial began in January 1902 and was pretty much exactly like the last one, except that instead of the death penalty, he only got life in prison. But when appealed, the case was once again overturned by the Republican Court of Appeals and sent back for another trial. Howard's third trial began April 1903, and this time the prosecution had a new trick up their sleeve.
I'm surprised that they're not just, like, the appellate courts aren't ruling anything, that they're just sending it back.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
They're overturning, and then it gets sent back because the prosecution is like, no, I'm not letting these people go.
Yeah, but appellate courts can also make rulings.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting that they're not choosing to, like, change the ruling. They're saying you need to do this again.
Yeah. I'm not sure if this was a Kentucky thing.
Well, they probably just didn't want the responsibility.
Maybe, yeah.
But interesting.
Yeah. So, as I said, the prosecution had a new trick up their sleeve for this third trial. They had Yutzi, 2 years into his prison sentence, come and testify. And with nothing to lose and hoping for some leniency in prison, Yutzi charged that former Governor Taylor had discussed the plan with Howard and himself. But it was really Taylor and Powers who had planned the attack, and that Howard indeed had fired the gun that killed William Goble.
Convenient that he's choosing now to change his story.
Exactly. So despite the defense's attempts to poke holes in this narrative, the jury again delivered a guilty verdict. The defense once again appealed it, but this time the Kentucky Court of Appeals had flipped back to a Democratic majority. They let the verdict stand, and the U.S. Supreme Court decided not to review that decision. As a result, Howard started his sentence of life in prison.
I really feel like this should have gone to the Supreme Court. Like, L on their part.
Yeah.
But what a roller coaster for Howard.
I know.
What about
3 trials?
3.
Yeah.
Same outcome every single time.
Yeah, awful.
What about Powers?
So Powers' second trial began a little before Howard's in October of 1901. Interestingly, 2 of the main witnesses against Powers had dropped out, saying that they were bribed and intimidated. In turn, the Democrats accused the Republicans of bribing the witnesses to flip their stories. Oh, and by the way, Judge Cantrell was still presiding because he refused to step down.
Of course.
Mm-hmm. The packed jury once again returned a guilty verdict and the same life imprisonment sentence to Powers. And, like Howard's case, Powers won his appeal, sending it back to square one. Yet another trial.
This is bananas.
Yep. So the third trial against Powers started in 1903. This time, Powers was getting increasingly worried about his position, with appeals court majority shifting and the prosecution seeking out the death penalty this time. Powers saw his trial as the last chance for freedom, and he was not going to go down without a fight. This time, Powers and the lawyers forced Judge Cantrell to step down through a court mandate. And while the new judge was also a Democrat, he definitely was less partisan than Cantrell was. The defense also went to work once again refuting the testimony of Yutzi and others brought by the prosecution. Close to 40 days into the trial, Powers himself took the stand and delivered an incredible speech, which lasted for 7 hours over 2 days.
Whoa.
Yeah. The speech and the contents of the speech were distributed nationwide, and in the courtroom, many folks were brought to tears by the end.
What did he say?
In his speech, Powers exclaimed that the killing of Goble was the worst possible thing that could have befallen the Republican Party, and that the killer should be brought to justice. The only problem was, he was not the guilty party. Powers ended with this picture of his poor mother. Quote unquote, with a frail and trembling hand, she moves back the white hair from her sorrow-ridden brow. Powers then asked to move the jury to, quote unquote, liberate the suffering of the innocent and send an outraged boy back to the country he loves.
Really tugging at those heartstrings.
Mm-hmm. And as I said, there wasn't a dry eye in the theater. And many accounts even reported that some members of the jury were even brought to tears. And again, this is a Democratic majority in the jury. Mm-hmm. However, this long-winded testimony was not enough, and Powers was served a guilty verdict once again. But this time, instead of life in prison, Powers would be hanged.
So that's it, right? Like, this is over?
Not quite.
Of course not.
With a sliver of hope, Powers appealed his verdict once again. While the appeals court had shifted to having a majority of Democratic judges, a small miracle happened, and 2 of the Democratic judges sided with the Republicans, overturning the verdict once again for the 3rd time.
Oh my gosh. I feel like at a certain point, you just shouldn't be able to be retried again.
Like, the emotional, like, trauma of, like, 3 trials.
And clearly, the lower court just isn't capable of handling this.
Right.
It needs to go. I really think that the higher courts just didn't want the responsibility.
Yeah, 1,000%. So in between Powers' appeal and the start of his fourth trial, a few notable things occurred. First, Powers wrote his autobiography, My Own Story, which I read a good bit of for this case. The book was well received overall and did help him win some sympathy with a broader audience. Second, Judge Cantrell moved to the Court of Appeals. So the way Powers and most people saw it, there was no way the appeals court would overturn another guilty verdict for Powers. Thirdly, the prosecution's leading attorney, Mr. Campbell, died, which was great news for Powers and the defense, as again, Campbell had been absolutely brutal and was in cahoots with William Gobles' own brothers. So unlike the first three trials, the jury selection process actually ended up pretty good for Powers, and it wasn't packed full of Goble Democrats. This go-around, the defense really focused on discrediting Utsi and even brought in a witness that accused Utsi of being the assassin, saying that it was Utsi who took a rifle out of Powers' office, shot Goble, and then sold the gun to another random guy. And you might also remember that Utsi was also the guy who maybe bought those special bullets.
Okay, that's interesting.
Even more interesting is that this time, the trial resulted in a hung jury in January 1908. So this is 8 years after Goble was shot.
This was the one thing the case was missing, was a hung jury.
Yep.
What happened next? Did they retry him a fifth time?
Actually, no.
Oh, thank God.
You see, by the time that the fourth trial concluded, there was a Republican governor in Kentucky. So Governor Augustus Everett Wilson believed that Powers and Howard were innocent and that Utsi had acted on his own to kill Goble. As a result, he issued pardons to Powers, Howard, and former Governor Taylor, amongst some others. Curiously, Utsi was also later pardoned in 1919, but by Democratic Governor James D. Black.
Can you tell us what the final rulings were for each of these men before they were pardoned?
Yes.
Where their cases stood?
So Utsi was guilty. He never appealed his verdict, so he had been in prison this entire time.
And that was life in prison?
Yes.
Okay.
Howard also got, by the third trial, Howard also got life imprisonment, so not the death penalty. And so he was also in prison. And then Powers' fourth trial concluded in a hung jury.
Okay.
Yeah.
So no one was facing the death penalty when these pardons came down?
Correct, yes.
So what else happened? Is this finally the end?
Kind of. So because of everything that had happened, Utsi's wife divorced him, and he was considered a disgrace to Republicans. So it seems like he lost a lot of his friends overall, especially after flip-flopping his story and essentially becoming a Democratic ally. But he eventually remarried and later served as a county clerk. Howard went back to his home in Clay County and became kind of a hermit, refusing to see old friends and refusing to talk about the matter at all. However, as James Clotter wrote, Howard was in Georgetown, Kentucky the day of Judge Cantrell's funeral, just by happenstance. And when someone asked him if he was going to attend the funeral, Howard said, no, but that, quote unquote, I'm willing for it to be known that his funeral has my hearty endorsement.
That goes hard.
I love that. Yeah, his funeral has my endorsement. And for what it's worth, Howard maintained he was innocent for the rest of his life. Caleb Powers, though, he's another beast. He was actually elected to serve as a member of Congress and served from March 4th, 1911 to March 3rd, 1919. Notably, he was not a candidate for renomination in 1918. In 1912, Powers also served as delegate to the Republican National Convention. He later moved to Washington, D.C., where he served as an assistant counsel for the United States Shipping Board from 1921 until his death in Baltimore at age 64 on July 25th, 1932. And like Howard, Powers maintained that he was innocent and never switched up the testimony he gave at trial.
Wow. So we don't actually know who killed Goble.
Yeah.
3 men were found guilty and at various times sentenced to either death or life imprisonment.
Yeah.
But eventually all 3 of them would be pardoned.
Yeah.
And then Caleb went on to have a successful career in national politics.
Yes, correct.
I find it very suspicious that Caleb was not there that day.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like he should have been there that day.
I kind of think that Utsi looks really good for it, but I definitely think Powers was involved.
But also, did they look at anyone else? Or did they just make Utsi look good for it?
Right.
Because did they look at every bullet purchased that day? what if a bunch of people purchased special bullets? Like,
Right.
I just don't really have faith that they looked at enough people.
Yeah. Also, though, the one witness, though, that was like, yeah, like, then he sold this gun to a random guy, like, kind of out in the farms, is, like, also an interesting thing. Like, he was trying to get rid of the evidence.
I guess that means that they had to have some sort of ballistics back then.
Yeah.
If they would have been able to maybe trace it back to the gun.
Or, again, it was a witness. I don't know. Again, it was like a rifle. All rifles look the same back in the day. Like, who knows?
But then underscoring all of this is the fact that, like, these men were not guaranteed a fair trial.
Yeah, not at all. Not a fair or speedy trial. And Caleb Powers talked a lot about that in his book, too, that, like, even once the jury, once it did result in a hung jury, and that was, what date was that? Hold on. Like, 8 years after Goble was shot. Like, Powers wasn't, like, just out and about. Like, he was in jail the entire time. They didn't let him out on bail or anything like that.
Yeah, I think that if you believe that the cards are stacked against you, you will probably do a lot of things that make you look guilty because people are assuming you're guilty, and so you need to start covering tracks whether or not they're real.
Yeah.
So I just don't know how much stock to put in anything with this.
I do think the pardon, though, is interesting. Like, I really can't wrap my head around why you would ask for a pardon that explicitly says, I pardon you for your complicity in the assassination of William Goble, and you carry that around and you didn't have some part or knowledge of the plan, right? Like, I just have a hard time, because if you really were innocent, I just don't think that would ever be, like, on your mind to do. Like, you might get a pardon that said for any, a blanket pardon, right? Maybe like that, but I just can't, like, being so specific in that written pardon kind of, like, makes me think that, again, like, he did have some role in it.
We would need to know what he asked for, though, because what if the governor just kind of wrote it for him, like, saw the speculation and was like, I want to help out a friend.
Maybe. Yeah.
I don't know. I'm really disappointed in the Supreme Court in this one. This seems like, they're supposed to respond to constitutional issues.
Yeah.
And this, to me, is a constitutional issue.
Yeah, I guess they just kept citing that it had no federal. Yeah.
I see that.
No federal issue at state. Like, this was a state issue.
Yeah, but it's a state issue that could boil into a federal issue.
Right. And a civil war.
Yeah. And it's a question that I think needs to be settled in law.
Yeah.
But there are no, I don't know. It's interesting.
Isn't it? And again, all this happened. We had no idea about it.
Yeah, no idea. This was never even in the history books. Maybe in Kentucky it is. But
we're not from Kentucky, so we don't know. Yeah. I'm sure everyone who's from Kentucky right now is like, you don't know about this.
Well, this is insane. And a bit reminiscent of current events. But I feel better. If Kentucky can get through this, the United States can get through anything.
And that, my friends, is the story of Caleb Powers and the assassination of William Goble.
Whew.
Harley, do you want to gavel us out?
Please.